All right, hello. We are live and welcome back to Mission Top for another live stream. Mission Top is a farmstead and ranch. It is a family, but it is a place for cultivating philosophia. And these live streams have been part of a 90-day project of live streams to cultivate content to be made into video essays, which are kind of the mainstay of this channel. We are now reaching the end of this project. This is the last week. Last week we had a good kind of penultimate week, except for the last day. If some of you were wondering, you noticed that we didn't stream on Friday. Once again, my internet equipment broke, and I had to get them to rush me some new equipment, and so that was the reason we didn't stream on Friday. But here we are. New equipment is back. Everything's rolling. At least hopefully it does. There's always the chance it could fail once again. But for the moment, things are looking good. And so we're going to try to finish out this project strong. And then after that, I think my plan is still to stream periodically, maybe once a week, maybe less than that. But more than anything, work on this tremendous amount of content that has been furthered by doing these streams and getting your feedback and seeing what kind of interested you most and etc., which mainly has been things tied to movies, which goes in very well into our topic today. And so that is the future of what will be happening to these streams and this channel. For the most part, yeah, just a focus on getting out video essays that in more finely tuned ways push forth all this content that's been developed over the course of this 90 days of streaming. And with that, let's jump into the topic of the day of Lord of the Rings as being a precursor to a Judeo-Christian education. It's kind of hard to title this one because the essence of what I wanted to convey is that I've been exploring the idea of using Lord of the Rings to prepare my children for kind of a deep dive into the Judeo-Christian world. I mean, we are a religious family, so of course their whole life has kind of been immersed in Christianity and the Hebrew Bible and things like that, but not in the way that, for example, none of them have actually read the Old Testament. You know, it's a very difficult book. It's a thick book containing many books, right? And even myself, I've never actually to this point read all of the Old Testament books all the way through. I've read many of the individual books, but not all of them together. And I realized that in order to do that, and in order to do it in the way that I wanted to, which is to get my kids immersed completely into the Judeo-Christian story, to fully participate in that story, not just as something where you're learning kind of on the surface these stories from something that almost seem like, you know, something from another world, another land, another time, and, you know, very debatable today by today's standards of historicity, whether they existed, happened historically at all. You know, that's one sense we have to those books. And what I want my children, not my Christians to do, my children to do, is to be able to actually live within that comprehensive story world of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian story in the New Testament. And we'll go in a little bit as to why I want them to do that, as compared to the other worldviews, you could say, on offer from the world today. But the main point of this whole video is to be why I see Lord of the Rings as a great, nice precursor world to dive into at that kind of same deep level. Of course, my kids have seen the movies, but none of them have actually read all the way through the books. We attempted to at one time as a family and got about, a quarter of the way through, but we have not, all of us, read them all through together and talked about them and dived into that deep world that contains kind of worlds within worlds, you could say, of the Tolkien legendarium. And so we're going to talk about today why I think that is engaging in that world that Tolkien's created is actually a great preparer, you could say, again, precursor, forerunning kind of project to prepare my children to then be ready to dive deeper into the Judeo-Christian world, if you want to call it that, because it's based out of the Hebrew Bible and leading into the Christian story of the New Testament. But first, I need to give you some background as to where these thoughts come from. And so if you'll kind of indulge me before we get back to the actual Lord of the Rings and talking about that, I need to kind of lay a little bit of the background of why this matters and how this got brought about in my mind. Because only with the background, I think, does it make sense of what's actually being pursued here and why. It's over this weekend that I've been thinking a lot about the nature of education and Lord of the Rings in general. Part of that's due to the fact I've been listening to the first few episodes of a podcast called the Amin Sewell podcast, which you can find on the usual podcast places. I've been listening to it on Apple Podcasts. And there's a lot of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings podcasts out there, but I've known about this one for some time. Again, through connections through Jonathan Pageau, who many of you know, I really appreciate as a thinker. And this podcast looks at the Tolkien legendarium from the perspective of Orthodox Christianity. And that's actually a perspective that I like to look through because Orthodox Christianity has these deep ties to the value of the ancient world, you could say. And the fact that the relevance of that kind of ancient style to the world has not gone away today. And so there's some very deep tie-ins between the way that Orthodox Christianity still looks at the world and the way that Lord of the Rings, the very nature of the world that is structured there. And then you have the fact that Tolkien was a devout Roman Catholic and had Christianity definitely flowing through him. And even though, as we'll talk about, the Lord of the Rings is not meant as a Christian allegory to kind of retell the Christian story, it contains Christian structure in it. And so this podcast really focuses on that, and I've been enjoying just going through the first few episodes. I think there's like 40 episodes now. I'm just in the first couple, but that's where my mind has been this week. And then on education, because here we are homeschooling right now. We've homeschooled a lot of the last couple years. We haven't always homeschooled. My children have also been educated in public schools as well. But right now we're homeschooling, and so I'm always constantly thinking, what kind of education do I want to give my children? What would be of most value for them to know? And so for this summer, just as they're diving into summer, we're not going to kind of quit school altogether like the public education system would, but maybe give a little bit different focus over the summer. We've been focusing a lot on American history through the rest of the normal school year here, and they've been getting some science too and some math and the usual kind of things. But I really wanted to push things more, give them a kind of a fresh direction. And so as my mind's been on this, Lord of the Rings presented itself as the perfect the perfect project, I guess you could say, for an entire summer. But I want to make clear that these principles that I'm going to be talking about apply whether you homeschool your children or not. Because underlying all this, one thing I would hope that parents realize, that I think a lot of parents don't realize, is that it's imperative for parents to, in any case, fully see themselves as responsible for their children's education. It's very easy when we have the public school system to just kind of put our kids in there and just assume that they're going to receive the full education that they should have to be successful participants in the world. But I think the evidence is very much contrary to the fact that that's going to occur in the public school system. Again, there's a lot of well-intentions in the public school system, a lot of good people that are the teachers and the administrators and things like that, but it's just not the institution that is going to give a complete institution or education, especially to prepare children to participate meaningfully, to find meaning in today's world, and to have a satisfying and a full life participating in the world as we know it today. In fact, there's many in the kind of the basic curriculum that's offered in the public school system. I would argue there's kind of steps taken there that kind of make it very likely that people will suffer crises of meaning in today's world because of the limited nature of the worldview that's offered in a public education. So that's why I think it's imperative of parents to whether your kids are getting being homeschooled or in public education, to be thinking in this way of saying, what do my children really need out of an education? What should a comprehensive education provide? And are they getting that in the public schools? What are the gaps and of which I need to be responsible for, right? So I've asked myself that question a lot, and here's some of the basics that have come to my mind. Here are my answer to what an education should provide. And you'll notice that it has very little to do with specific subjects and more basically some basic skills that kids should come out with. So one, they should be able to read very well and enjoy reading, right? Two, they should be able to write very well, to convey thought and argument clearly through the written word, and also be interesting in their writing. Three, I do think they should have the arithmetic and basic algebra needed to make good decisions in everyday life. But I think if you're anything like me, like most people are, you'll know that beyond basic algebra, there's not much of use in most of our lives for the rest of mathematics. So I don't see that as a bad thing. I just see that as part of a basic education, you don't need that. But what you do need more than anything, and here's the fundamental skill you need, is the ability to learn and a love of learning. Because then if you want to explore those higher mathematics or any other subject, you have the means to do that. I mean, that to me is the essence of a successful education. There's other things that I am teaching my children. I am teaching them scientific method and the most important scientific theories, like the theory of evolution, so that they can understand the world, understand basic news articles, and advance, new trends that are coming out in society, and they can make sense of those. So we do have that. I've also thought a lot lately how there's a lot of practical things that very well could be part of a public education system, and it's an awful shame that they aren't, but that I at least can offer my children as far as their education. So one of those would be to cultivate and to know how to cultivate food and eat well in all the senses of that word, right? And then to be able to cultivate money. Not just be able to work a job, but cultivate money in the greater senses of that word, so that whatever they're doing in life, whatever they want to do, they know that they'll be able to cultivate enough money to do the things they want. I want them to know they can provide themselves shelter, so that wherever they are in life, you'll notice that they can cultivate food and find food. They can have money and understand what money is and how to generate it. They have shelter. So, if all kids came out of school, like high school, being able to do those things, think of all the government programs, right, that would be unnecessary, or how many fewer people we'd have covered on there, because people would be able to provide those basic things for themselves no matter what, right? And all that goes into not just being able to do that for themselves, but for a few other individuals as well, a family as well. But as I've thought about it, it's not just those subjects, it's not just these practical skills that I want my kids to have kind of before they're released out into the world, if you will. But I also want them and need them to have a map of meaning to make sense of the world, kind of a fundamental worldview by which they can look out into the world and have those basic senses of this is what the world is, this is where it came from, this is who I am in the world, and here's the basic things that I'm striving to achieve in the world. And that worldview offer sufficient meaning and guidance in their life so that they can not have, again, crises of meaning and existence and things like that, which you see plenty of people having today, which means that this isn't happening to many people today. Many people don't have this kind of fundamental worldview. Again, look at the public school system. You'll find some worldviews are offered, right? In public school system, you'll get a basic history of your country, but today that's become so muddled, right? Because either one, you'll usually get a history of your own country that just frames it as an evil place and as something that should have never existed and has just exploited people or something like that. Or on other schools will give you kind of this shining city on a hill version of your country that had this noble past and all these heroic exploits and all these things that kind of gloss over a lot of the atrocities, that may have that happened in your country. I mean, the United States is a complex place. It has both tremendously good things and tremendously bad things that have occurred from it. And usually our kids are not getting that nuanced view of their country. So they end up with a clouded view of their very, the basic element of society that they're a citizen in, right? So that gives them a clouded worldview. And then the other one that's generally pushed is this flat, meaningless scientific worldview that trains them to think that they are not even experiencing the real world when they're out in the world, right? They look at a table, and instead of looking at seeing the beauty of the table and focusing on their experience of the table and this, the sense of craftsmanship in it, the sense of how their hand feels on the wood and enjoying that and something like that. Instead, they look at that table and see, this isn't really what I think it is. It's mostly made of carbon. It has these chemical properties that makes it somewhat flammable, things like that. And so the more that this scientific worldview is pushed as kind of the fundamental worldview by which you should look at the world, the more the world becomes meaningless. And hence, another thing why people have these crises of meaning. And then, the public school system is also giving you this basic worldview about what is your path of participation in society. And what is it? You should get more education. You should get a job. And usually the jobs it's kind of pushing you into are more kind of the traditional jobs, working for an entity, either small or big, but working for one. I mean, it's very rare that kids are taught to cultivate, to learn how to cultivate money, to generate money, to begin things, in an entrepreneurial sense of the world. They're given a very limited sense of, okay, I'm supposed to do all this to get a job, to participate in society, to pay my taxes, to save for retirement so I can retire someday. And that's part of the worldview that they're given, but which, is somewhat helpful, right? Makes it so that a state isn't having to take care of all its citizens. But on the other hand, it doesn't offer those fundamental questions of meaning. It doesn't give a fundamental map of the world, right? And so that's all to say that what an education, a complete education, should offer is also a fundamental map of meaning. Okay, and that's what gets us closer to how Lord of the Rings, which then leads us into a Judeo-Christian worldview, could be a better path to that. I see a few people here on here. Again, maybe some names that I haven't seen as often, or maybe for the first time. So welcome, Augusto. You're saying greetings from Brazil. Glad to have you on here. I'm hoping some of this is helpful as far as talking about homeschooling. We can definitely talk more about it in the future. And thanks for letting me know that that's something you're interested in. You haven't been the only person, in fact, and maybe it'd be a good one to talk about with my wife this Friday, as we have her on usually on Fridays, and she's very much involved in the homeschooling of our children as well. And we could just focus straight on that. And then it looks like Piermin, greetings from Germany. Glad to have you on here, and hope things are well there in Germany right now. So moving along, once you realize that a regular education, a public education, doesn't offer this kind of fundamental worldview that answers sufficient questions, that gives sufficient meaning to people in life, then it makes perfect sense why so many youth spend tremendous amounts of time, money, energy to essentially escape this regular mundane world and spend time participating in essentially better worlds that are more beautiful and have more meaning. And just the other day, I was in front of a group of youth talking to them, and I asked them, what was their favorite world? And it's still the same ones that it probably may be for you. Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. There are a few other answers, related to some video games and things like that. So obviously, video games offer some of these really captivating, meaningful worlds. Books, are seeming like it ebbs and flows as to popularity, but some of them had some other books that they mentioned. And then you can see that the other thing that people fall into because they don't have an alternative fundamental world to participate in are these ideologies and movements that come up. You can see how something like communism, in the way that it offered a fundamental framing of the world, was very attractive to a lot of people. And you can see the same thing, of course, with the other fundamental worldview on the other side, which would be fascism and Nazism, and how that captivated people. But of course, today there are so many people that, in their quest to find a story to live in essence, right? Because I'm kind of equating worldview with fundamental story that you participate in. A lot of people want to feel like they're participating in a meaningful story, so they grab on to these ideological movements, these identity movements and whatnot. And it makes perfect sense, because in your regular education, you're not being offered a satisfying, story to live in, again, as far as your national identity or as far as some other identity or religious identity or something like that, that then would lead you to not find those other kinds of worlds attractive. And so realizing that, the only two stories that I see that are the real, the only ones, like, as, let's say, for my children who are here living in the United States, really the only two fundamental stories that I see them as possibly being able to live in and find a comprehensive enough map of meaning within them right now would be a national story, one based in kind of a national history, a history of the United States, and the other a Christian story, in as much as, the world around them is Christian, their family's Christian, their relatives are Christian, their community is Christian. I could see it different for some other kid in the United States who lives in a Muslim community, has a Muslim family and stuff. They could find that within that kind of religious worldview or other religions like that. But for most kids in America, their best shot is really only going to be those two stories, a Christian one or a national story, because those are the only ones that you can actually live in a comprehensive way. And what I mean by that is, think of all these other worldviews that people like to live in, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or all the other worlds that you see kind of exemplified at a cosplay type of environment where people are dressing up as their favorite characters. I mean, that's fun and all, right? But those worlds are obviously, they have their bounds, and they don't relate enough. They don't map enough into this world, and there's not a history enough of them in this world. And so, yeah, you can have your events, you can go to them, you can dress up. There's even people that have gone so far, I've heard, as kind of Harry Potter, doing kind of Harry Potter liturgy and actually reading the texts and dressing up and having some sort of kind of religious experience with it. But they're so limited compared to these other kinds of worldviews that actually have happened in some sense, right? You think about the Christian story, and I'm not talking about a debate on historical facts and scholarship and things like that about Christianity, but in the sense that for thousands of years now, whole cultures have lived within the story, and it has influenced their lives, and they built their cities around it, and they built structures, and events have taken place, and wars around it, and there's liturgy, and there's texts, and all these things continuing up to this day. You see how that is something you can actually continue to live out, because the very Christian story itself accounts for what's going on today, has this sense for what comes next, that there will be some next great kind of arrival of some new thing of the Christ again, and an overturning of the world again, and it hasn't yet occurred. So again, there's a way that it's an ongoing story, right, in a way that you just can't get that from Harry Potter, right? And then you have the kind of national stories where, again, the difficulty about living in something like that today is that it's so muddied. The way that, like in the United States, obviously you just look at the news or whatnot, and you see that it's very hard to live any particular story about the United States right now, because even though it's all happened, you have all these different groups with differing views of the story. And so you can kind of try to live out yours, but you're going to be in constant conflict with these other people around you telling you that your version of the story is wrong, and this and that. So it's very difficult to have that be your primary means of kind of living in the world today, is by just trying to live out some sort of national history, national identity leading to something else. That's not to say that I don't also teach that to my children. I am teaching them, like as I said, United States history, and trying to give them a, make them realize you are Americans. This is part of your world, and in some sense has to be part of your worldview. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be a satisfying enough one to kind of completely define the most basic parts of your life and what you should be headed towards in life. So that's where I arrive as the Christian story, as really the only one that you, again, a kid in the United States who isn't part of some other religious tradition actually has a shot of having some greater comprehensive story that has a fundamental backstory and an accounting of where they are in the story, and an accounting of where the story is going from here. Enough to make sufficient sense of your life and say, yeah, I can participate in this story and live within it, as countless individuals have before me in life, and how even millions and billions of people continue to do today. So it's again the only viable one that I have for my children to do. So in that vein, I have the task then to actually make that a viable story to live in, because again, of course, in our world, that's very difficult given the education that that they have, which doesn't, there's a lot of things obviously that make it difficult to live within a religious worldview today, especially that scientific worldview and the way that it's taught, but also the way that there's this whole other, I guess there is one other worldview that you could live in today in the United States, and that's just that general consumer based society, that capitalistic consumer based structure of story, I guess you could say, that has a pretty good comprehensive guidance as to who you are and what you should do. You are both a consumer or producer. Your job is to either make money and then consume with that money, or it's to start something and generate as much as you can, and that's the goal of life, and you move through that, and then your job is to either produce products and sell them to people, or it's to go and buy them from others. Obviously, a lot of people define themselves completely by that story, so that is one, but I reject that one as one that will fundamentally provide meaning for my children. So that's why I don't pursue that particular story, and I've talked about a lot about that on these streams. So anyway, again, I come back to the Christian story, but then that task of actually getting my children to live inside of it and participate inside of it in the same way that they want to, right? With like Harry Potter, or especially they've been into Studio Ghibli films lately that have really been, let's just say, working on them. They're, for example, just a little example, my children who we were trying to teach them piano over the last few years, and we've kind of forced them to, and they made a little bit of progress, but not much. Well, Studio Ghibli films almost all have really great piano music underlying them. And once my kids got into Studio Ghibli films, one of my sons got some sheet music and started learning it. And it was way beyond his skill level, because he was because he was motivated. He worked really hard and started progressing. Then all the other kids saw they could too, so they all got this music, and now they've like jumped inordinate levels in order to learn these Studio Ghibli themes, again because they want to, in some sense, participate in these stories. Well, how do I get my kids to learn to do that, but with the Christian story? Because again, it's not easy based off of today's historical standards, based off of the scientific worldview, based off of our sense of literalism that we have in the world today. And so that's finally where we get back to Lord of the Rings, okay? Because Lord of the Rings has a quality about it that is different from these other worldviews that we have just talked about. It's different from Harry Potter. It's different from Star Wars. Star Wars kind of gets close in the way that it has been built out more by other people, aside from just George Lucas or whatnot, but still doesn't quite get to the level of Lord of the Rings. The Marvel universe doesn't offer it, and even these more ideological worldviews of the day are very quite limited when you look at Lord of the Rings and sense how it is in many senses a living, complete world. And a lot of people have noticed that's because Lord of the Rings, had its world created by Tolkien and tremendous effort put into the world itself prior to the actual stories being written within it, right? And so that quality that you feel from it, that this is a real world in a sense, or that the depth and the richness that you sense in the Lord of the Rings is due to the fact that there is this underlying mythology to it. There's languages, there's this backstories and history reaching thousands of years prior to the events of what goes on that all color everything to give it that richness that it has. And on this podcast that I was listening to this morning, Amin Sewell, they were talking about how other fantasy writers, who's it? George Martin that wrote the Game of Thrones, or the Fire and Ice, series that turned into Game of Thrones, or Terry Brooks, who's also a real prolific writer. That their worlds very much seem kind of like cardboard cutouts. That have they're all kind of just in a present sense of the world. Of course, they try to build a backstory as much as they can, but nobody gets as close to building this kind of richness as Tolkien did, right? And so that's where I bring in order to prepare my children for, let's say, the Hebrew Bible, especially, for the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, which has that sort of richness to it. And that's what makes it so difficult to a lot of people, is that has, that has a quality that goes back, very anciently, you could say. Even though you have like a timeline in the Old Testament, you have this sense that especially its earliest stories, and then many of the images and the the gods that are mentioned and things like that have their roots that go very far back into humanity that give it that richness. But it gives it its difficulty too, because it's not as easy as Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or something to grasp some of that in the Old Testament. So that's why I'm going to try to prepare my children for that by showing them how to do it within, let's say, a simpler world that offers that types of richness, and that would be Lord of the Rings. So what we're going to do is, we're just going to read them and go through, but I'm going to ask them, kind of the task that we're going to focus on is to ask them to try to find Christian structure, or you could say Judeo-Christian structure within the story as we read it. And we'll kind of talk about those things. I'll be very much teaching them what I mentioned earlier, that the Lord of the Rings is not an allegory in the way that you could kind of say parts of the Chronicles of Narnia are. And I guess that was kind of a dispute that Tolkien had with C.S. Lewis, as I understand it, that Lewis much more kind of believed in allegory and representing story patterns kind of one for one, but just in a different sense, in order that there was value in that, where you can see the Lord of the Rings, it doesn't have that kind of allegorical sense of Christianity in it, that, here's the Christ character living out the entire, Christ story, and here's the other characters around him, but they're just been named different and called different creatures or whatnot. Instead, Lord of the Rings has something like, you see the death and resurrection kind of motif in Gandalf, the fact of kind of sacrificing yourself for others for a greater purpose, which then allows you to come back, alive in a different sense, in a transformed sense, and be even more powerful than you were before. Or you have the return of the king motif in Aragorn, and the way that coming from the way that he comes from kind of the outside in a way that nobody knew him or anticipated him being the king, but him showing up nonetheless and having it in a sense both the character and the lineage, you could say, to be the actual king. So those are kind of two examples of what I'm getting at. And through that, and through learning more about the story, and so very well it may lead us into something like the Silmarillion. If any of you know, the Tolkien Legendarium. The Silmarillion, to a lot of people, operates kind of like the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible to the Tolkien Legendarium, and offers more of that backstory richness that explains a little bit some of the, you could say, kind of the structure, the hierarchical structure of gods and beings that are at play within Tolkien's world at large. So maybe we'll get into a little bit of that to understand things better, and dig into some of the appendices and things like that Tolkien is known for, and all that in preparation to show my children, that it is in that kind of diving into a world like this and understanding it at that level, a world that can be understood at that level, that then they'll be able to, participate in a much richer, greater degree in Lord of the Rings, which I want them to do. I mean, I've had great joy in my life from participating in that story, thinking about it, pulling out these applicable things to the real world and whatnot. But the great goal of things will be to hopefully show my children there's a limit to that with Lord of the Rings, and if they want that kind of participation in a world, in a magical world, or you could say an enchanted world, a world of powers and principalities and gods and unseen forces operating in the world, then there is in fact another worldview that offers that. It's more difficult, but there is in fact one, and it's the one that they've already have some familiarity with. But that's where I hope we'll then be able to make the jump into the Hebrew Bible more and show, look, this is the same kind of thing going on. This rich, deep world that underlies our entire culture, has given us a sense of what's right and wrong and whatnot. But much more than that, it gives us a sense for who we are. It gives us a sense for what we are to be, right? And then you add, of course, the Christianity on top of that, and the story, at least for Christians, becomes even more complete, more rich as to where we are in the story, how we're still participating in it, and whatnot. So, that is the essence of what I wanted to say today, and just show how both the need to offer children a more comprehensive worldview, and how I'm going to try to lead into the comprehensive worldview of the Judeo-Christian world in ways that I think society and culture and even religions aren't doing a very good job at today, and how a stepping stone to that for me is going to be the Lord of the Rings, because I think it will hone the same kind of skills, the same kind of ability to immerse yourself within a world that has a sound structure that you could say maps onto reality. I guess that's a good way to end up exactly what's going on. The Lord of the Rings has a structure that we sense in some way maps onto reality, to the real world. It's not factual in the way that other aspects of history are, but in a sense it offers in many parts of the story something even more important than a historical fact or proposition. It offers more a participatory pattern of living that you can participate in, and those are the most important. That's actually what structures reality for us. So if my children can learn to do that along with me, because I'll be developing my skills along with it as well in that, then they can jump over to an even grander, more richer world that actually exists, that they can participate in because it is in this world. We got a chance to go to Jerusalem as part of a year of travel, and I think that has even opened up this possibility even more of them being able to make this jump, because they're able to sit there at the temple walls that they are reading about, in the Old Testament. They can go to these shores of Galilee and see this exists. There is this lake, this sea of Galilee. There are these towns that were visited and they were part of the story. They can walk through Hezekiah's tunnels in Jerusalem and then read about the moment in history that those tunnels existed. So there's a sense in which you can't go and do that to Hogwarts, right? I've been to Scotland and the landscape is all there, but the actual structure of the building is not, right? And Universal Studios just isn't the same thing now, is it? So yeah, that's what I wanted to say, and hopefully I was able to get it out. Saw Martin is on here as well. Thanks for popping in, Martin, and Federico, also from Brazil. Yeah, very nice to have people from Brazil. Again, a place I've never been to except for just the Sao Paulo airport on my way to Uruguay, which I did. I have spent 2 years in Uruguay, so I speak Spanish, but unfortunately not very adept at Portuguese, which I can understand a little bit, but yeah, not very adept at speaking it. So thank you for being on here. Anyone, if I'm about to wrap up. If anybody has any other questions or comments on the presentation today, please put them forth now. As to what's coming up here on the channel, today I am wrapping up a video that involves the movie Walter Mitty, the Secret Life of Walter Mitty, and focuses on the principle of change with that. And then one of these days here, I will be finally deciding to publish another video that's fairly wrapped up on Interstellar, and that one's a biggie. It's like 50-minute video, so it may take any of you that I hope people actually get through the end. I'm not presupposing that they will, but it takes, in any case, if people do find it interesting, it'll take a while to get through. So those two are the things that are coming up as to my regular videos. And other than that, that's what I'm going to be focusing on this week, getting in these streams in the morning and then wrapping up this project on Friday. So absent any other comments or questions, I'm going to wrap up now. So thank you for being here, and look forward to having you back on these streams or these other videos on this channel. So this is Gary from Mission Top signing out, and hope you have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world.